Heisenberg essay or writing. A Werner Heisenberg writing. Truth dwells in the deeps. The resumption of international contacts once again brought together old friends. Thus, in the early summer of 1952, atomic physicists assembled in Copenhagen to discuss the construction of a European accelerator. I was most interested in this project because I was hoping that a large accelerator would help us to determine whether or not the high-energy collision of two elementary particles could lead to the production of a host of further particles. As I had assumed, whether indeed we were entitled to assume the existence of many new particles, and if so, whether, like the stationary states of atoms or molecules, they differed only in their symmetries, masses, and lifetimes. The main topic in the meeting was thus a matter of great personal concern, and if I do not report it here, it is simply because I must relate the conversation with Niels Bohr and Wolfgang Pauli on that occasion. Wolfgang had come over from Zurich, and the three of us were sitting in the small conservatory that ran from Bohr's official residence down to the park. We were discussing the old theme, namely, whether our interpretation of quantum theory in this very spot 25 years ago had been correct, and whether or not our ideas had since become part of the intellectual stock-in-trade of all physicists. Niels had this to say. Some time ago there was a meeting of philosophers, most of them positivists, here in Copenhagen, during which members of the Vienna Circle played prominent part. I asked to address them on the interpretation of quantum theory. After my lecture, no one raised any objections or asked any embarrassing questions, and I must say, this very fact proved a terrible disappointment to me. For those who are not shocked when they first came across quantum theory cannot possibly have understood it. Probably I spoke so badly that no one knew what I was talking about. Wolfgang objected. The fault need not necessarily have been yours. It is part and parcel of the positivist creed that facts must be taken for granted, sight unseen, so to speak. As far as I remember, Wittgenstein says, "The world is everything that is the case. The world is the totality of facts, not of things." Now, if you start from that premise, you are bound to welcome any theory representative of the case. The positivists have gathered that quantum mechanics describes atomic phenomena correctly, and so they have no cause for complaint. What else we have had to add? Complementarity, interference of probabilities, uncertainty of relations, separation of subject and object, etc., strikes them as just so many embellishments, mere relapses into pre-scientific thought, bits of idle chatter that do not have to be taken seriously. Perhaps this attitude is logically defensible, but if it is, I for one can no longer tell what we mean when we say we have understood nature. Niels commented, "For my part, I can readily agree with the positivists about the things they want, but not about the things they reject. All the positivists are trying to do is to provide the procedures of modern science with a philosophical basis, or, if you like, a justification. They point out that the notions of the earlier philosophies lack the precision of scientific concepts, and they think that many of the questions posed and discussed by conventional philosophers have no meaning at all, that they are pseudo-problems and, as such, best ignored. Positivist insistence on concept clarity is, of course, something I fully endorse, but their prohibition of any discussion of the wider issues simply because we lack clear-cut enough concepts in this realm does not seem very useful to me. The same ban would prevent our understanding of quantum theory. Positivists, I tried to point out, are extraordinarily prickly about all problems having what they call a pre-scientific character. I remember a book by Philip Frank on causality, in which he dismisses a whole series of problems and formulations on the ground that all of them are relics of the old metaphysics, vestiges from the period of pre-scientific or animalistic thought. For instance, he rejects the biological concepts of wholeness and entelechy as pre-scientific ideas, and tries to prove that all statements in which these concepts are commonly used have no verifiable meaning. To him, metaphysics is a synonym for loose thinking, and hence a term of abuse. This sort of restriction of language doesn't seem very useful to me either. Niels said, "You know Schiller's poem, The Sentences of Confucius, which contains these memorable lines, 'The full mind is alone the clear, and truth dwells in the deeps.' The full mind, in our case, is not only an abundance of experience, but also an abundance of concepts by means of which we can speak about our problems and about phenomena in general. Only by using the whole variety of concepts when discussing the strange relationship between the formal laws of quantum theory and the observed phenomena, by lighting this relationship up from all sides and bringing out its apparent contradictions, can we hope to effect that change in our thought processes, which is a sine qua non of any true understandings of quantum theory." You mentioned Philip Frank's book on causality. Philip Frank was one of the philosophers to attend the Congress in Copenhagen, and he gave a lecture in which he used the term metaphysics simply as a swear word, or at best as a euphemism for unscientific thought. After he had finished, I had to explain my own position, and this I did roughly as follows. I began by pointing out that I could see no reason why the prefix meta should be reserved for logic and mathematics. Frank had spoken of metalogic and meta-mathematics, and why it was anathema in physics. The prefix, after all, merely suggests that we are asking further questions, i.e., the questions bearing on the fundamental concepts at a particular discipline, and why ever should we not be able to speak? And why should we not be able to ask such questions in physics? But I should start from the opposite end. Take the question, what is an expert? Many people will tell you that an expert is someone who knows a great deal about his subject. To this I would object, that no one can ever know very much about any subject. I would much prefer the following definition. An expert is someone who knows some of the worst mistakes that can be made in his subject and how to avoid them. Hence, Philip Frank ought to be called an expert on metaphysics, one who knows how to avoid some of its worst mistakes. I was not quite sure whether Frank was very happy about my praise, though I was certainly not offering it tongue-in-cheek. In all such discussions, what matters most to me is that we do not simply talk the deeps in which the truth dwells out of existence. That would mean taking a very superficial view. The same evening, Wolfgang and I continued the discussion alone. It was the season of the long nights. The air was balmy, twilight lasted until almost midnight, and as the sun travelled, just beneath the horizon, and just between the horizon, it bathed the city in a subdued bluish light, and so we decided to walk along the Langelini, a beautiful harbour promenade, with freighters discharging their cargo on either side. In the south, Langeline begins roughly where Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid rests on a rock beside the bench in the north. It is continued by a jetty that swings out into the basin and marks the entrance to Free Haven with a small beacon after we had been looking at the toing and froing of the ships in the twilight for quite a while. Wolfgang asked me, "Were you quite satisfied with Neil's remarks about the positivists? I gained the impression that you are even more critical of them than Niels himself, or rather that your criterion of truth differs radically from theirs. I should consider it utterly absurd, and Niels for one would agree, were I to close my mind from the problems and ideas of earlier philosophers simply because they cannot be expressed in a more precise language. True, I often have great difficulty in grasping what these ideas are meant to convey, but when that happens, I always try to translate them into modern terminology and to discover whether they throw up fresh answers. But I have no principled objections to the examination of old questions. Much I have no objections to using the language of any of the old religions. We know that religions speak in images and parables, and that these can never fully correspond to the meanings they are trying to express, but I believe that in the final analysis of the old religions try to express the same contents, the same relations, and all of these hinge around questions about values. The positivists may be right in thinking that it is difficult nowadays to assign a meaning to such parables. Nevertheless, we ought to make every effort to grasp their meaning, since it quite obviously refers to a crucial aspect of reality. Or perhaps we ought to try putting it into modern language, if it can no longer be confined in the old. If you think about such problems in that way, then quite obviously you cannot accept the equation of truth and predictive power. But what is your own criterion of truth in science? We may find it more helpful to revert to our old comparison beneath Ptolemy's astronomy and Newton's conception of planetary motions, if predictive power were indeed the only criterion of truth. Ptolemy's astronomy would be no worse than Newton's, but if we compare Newton to Ptolemy in retrospect, we gain the clear impression that Newton's equations express the paths of the planets much more fully and correctly than Ptolemy's did. That Newton so to speak, described the plan of matter, nature's own construction. Or to take an example from modern physics, when we learn that the principles of conservation and energy, charge, etc. have a quite universal character, that they apply in all branches of physics, and that they result from the symmetry inherent in the fundamental laws. Then we attempted to say that symmetry is a decisive element of the plan on which nature has been created. In saying this, I am fully aware that the words plan and created are once again taken from the realm of human experience, and that they are metaphors at best. But it is quite easy to see that everyday language must necessarily fall short here. I suppose that is all I can say about my own conception of scientific truth. Quite so, but positivists will object that you are making obscure, meaningless noises, whereas they themselves are models of analytic clarity. But where must we seek for the truth? In obscurity or in clarity? Niels has quoted Schiller's "Truth dwells in the depths." Are there such deeps? Is there any truth? And may these deeps perhaps hold the meaning of life and death. A few hundred yards away, a large liner was gliding past, and its bright lights looked quite fabulous and unreal in the bright blue dusk. For a few moments I speculated about the human destinies being played out behind the lit-up cabin windows, and suddenly Wolfgang's questions got mixed up with it all. What precisely was this steamer? Was it a mass of iron with a central power station of electric lights? Was it the expression of human intentions, a form resulting from inhuman relations? Or was it the consequences of biological law exerting their formulative powers not merely on protein molecules but also on steel and eclectic currents? Did the word intention reflect the existence merely of these formative powers or of these biological laws in the human consciousness? And what did the word merely mean in this context? My silent soliloquy now turned to more general questions. Was it utterly absurd to seek behind the ordering structures of this world a consciousness whose intentions were these very structures? Of course, even to put this question with an anthropomorphic lapse, since the word consciousness was after all based purely on human experience and ought therefore to be restricted to the human realm. But in that case, we would also be wrong to speak of animal consciousness when we have a strong feeling that we can do so significantly. We sense that the meaning of consciousness becomes wider, at the same time vaguer, if we try to apply it outside the human realm. The positivists have a simple solution. The world must be divided into that which we can see, say clearly, and the rest, which we had better pass over in silence. But can anyone conceive a more pointless philosophy, seeing that we can say clearly amounts to the next to nothing? If we admitted all that is unclear, we would probably be left with completely uninteresting and trivial tautologies. We walked on in silence, and had soon reached the northern tip of the Langolini, whence we continued along the jetty as far as the small beacon. In the north, we could still see a bright strip of red. In these latitudes, the sun does not travel far beneath the horizon. The outlines of the harbour installations stood out sharply, and after we had been standing at the end of the jetty for a while, Wolfgang asked me quite unexpectedly, "Do you believe in a personal God?" I know, of course, how difficult it is to attach a clear meaning to this question, but you can probably appreciate its general purport. May I rephrase your question, I asked. I myself should prefer the following formulation. Can you, or anyone else, reach the central order of things or events whose existence seems beyond doubt as directly as you can reach the soul of another human being? I am using the term soul quite deliberately so as to not be misunderstood. If you put your question like that, I would say yes, and because my own experiences do not matter so much, I might go on to remind you of Pascal's famous text, the one he kept sewn in his jacket. It was headed Fire, and began with the words, God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, not of the philosophers and the sages. In other words, you think that you can become aware of the central order with the same intensity as of the soul of another person. Perhaps. Why did you use the word soul and not simply speak of another person? Precisely because the word soul refers to the central order, to the inner core of a being whose outer manifestations may be highly diverse and pass our understanding. If the magnetic force that has guided this particular compass, and what else was its source but the central order, should ever become extinguished, terrible things may happen to mankind. Far more terrible, even than concentration camps and atom bombs. But we did not set out to look into such dark recesses. Let's hope the central realm will light our way again. Perhaps in quite unsuspected ways. As far as science is concerned, however, Niels is certainly right to underwrite the demands of pragmatists and positivists for meticulous attention to detail and for semantic clarity. It is only in retrospect to its taboos that we can object to positivism. For if we may no longer speak or even think about the wider connections, we are without a compass and hence in danger of losing our way. Despite the late hour, a small boat made fast on the jetty and took us back to Kongens Nytorv, whence it was easy to reach Niels' house.